That's very sweet, Marion. Thank you.
I think it's kind of raunchy myself.
Welcome to Rags to Bitches,
a Dynasty Watch Party podcast. Kick back as we experience every slap, steely glare, and cruel barb from the 1981 primetime soap opera.
with discussions, games, and so much more. There's plenty of campy fun as we party our way through the big emotions and even bigger hair in the one,
The only Dynasty.
I'm AG,
And I'm Amy.
and today we're going to be breaking down Season 1, Episode 1 of Dynasty entitled Oil Part 1. Now that's a very big mouthful.
AG and I are friends who live a world apart, and through the pandemic, one in which I've had to quarantine for too many days, we have started to watch television shows together to connect. And Dynasty just happened to pop up on our radar, and here we are.
But I think another thing that's important, and I know you and I have both discussed this before, we don't want to be those people that are like, critical of the show and hate watching the show. If there's anyone out there who is a hardcore Dynasty fan and is worried that we're going to be having a go at it and trying to take it down, it's absolutely not our intention. So this is just going to be fun. It's going to be light. We're going to have games and trivia and all sorts of stuff.
In a world full of critics, be a cheerleader. And that's what we're doing with this podcast.
Exactly. So episode 1 of 3 for the pilot, which can we just talk about that for a moment, that this show that's about wealth and these excessive lifestyle has a 3-part pilot. Like, I don't think I can think of a single show that has a 3-part pilot.
I mean, extra, right?
It is. It's very extra, but like in the best possible way. And so I've got a list of a couple of movies that aren't as long as the pilot of this TV show. So I think 6 out of the 11 Star Wars movies are not as long as this pilot. Blue Velvet.
Blue Velvet is a great movie, by the way. If you haven't watched it, watch it.
I haven't watched it, but I plan to.
Yeah.
Spirited Away, Rocky, and Seven. Seven is not as long as this, which I guess goes to show that like the tone of something can drastically change how long it feels.
I think
like
for
Seven's
that,
a great movie, don't get me wrong, but
it's the anxiety that it makes you feel the whole entire time that makes it seem like it's so much longer.
yeah, exactly. So Dynasty, I guess before we get into it, what were your initial impressions? Because you came to it from a different perspective to me.
As a kid of the 80s, you grew up and your mother or your grandmother either watched Dynasty or they watched Dallas. And our family watched Dallas. And so the first thing that hit me hard was like the music and the way that it showed the gates of his house. And I knew that I was going to be in for a very pleasant ride. I feel like I recently rewatched the pilot of Dallas, and I feel that Dynasty gives you more of a punch for the pilot. You see more of the access. You see more of the characters their good and bad sides are revealed to you much quicker. But there's some similarities as well.
Well, I guess because like I never watched it, obviously, but the similarity that seems the most obvious is the idea of like it being centered around oil.
Right. Well, and there's like, specific things like someone getting married into the family and the family not necessarily being happy about it. In the case of Dallas, it's someone from a competing oil company. The daughter was married into the family. And for Dynasty, it's Krystle, who was not someone who was wealthy, marrying into the family. And there's things like there's one female character that likes to stir the pot a little bit. And that happens in both. And in both of them, there's that same female character is having a relationship with the quote unquote staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're kind of tropes of soap operas, aren't they? Because it's funny, you go to Dallas for that. To me, so much of this show reminded me of Downton Abbey, because a lot of people thought, oh, I'm watching this big classy masterpiece theater thing. And I'm like, no, it's filled with great actors. Don't get me wrong. But Downton Abbey is a soap opera, a primetime soap opera through and through. Like, it's just the accents.
Yeah, that makes it posh.
Yeah, that people think, oh, I feel so classy. So my initial impressions were that like I was expecting the gold level of dialogue as this.
Look, we all know you for the gold-digging slut that you really are.
Or maybe even like the subtle, nuanced. That's kind of what I was looking forward to. But we got something completely different. And I kind of knew going in that it had been retooled between season 1 and 2. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But I'm glad I didn't skip the first season because there's a lot to enjoy about it. And it does do things in a way that, as I said, it reminds me of sort of like Downton Abbey. And that was I don't know, maybe Dynasty was ahead of its time in what it was trying to achieve, because obviously we'll get into that later, but it kind of didn't do particularly well in the ratings, which is why it was being retooled. But yeah, maybe it was ahead of its time for trying to include more depth and not have caricatures.
Oh, I definitely think so. And some of the issues that they touch on definitely shows that Dynasty was trying to do something a little bit different. And maybe something that would be opening up conversations for people who watched it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, with those initial thoughts behind us, I guess we're going to move on to our episode breakdown. So this episode is, as I said before, season 1, episode 1, Oil Part 1. It aired on the 12th of January, 1981, which I believe was a Monday, because I think season 1 was a Monday night show, and then it changed to a Wednesday night show, which also helped in its ratings changing of the night too. It was written by Richard and Esther Shapiro, directed by Ralph Sineski, and it was ranked 12th, which for a pilot is probably not like stellar, but I think it's okay. I'm not the most knowledgeable person when it comes to like Nielsen ratings. I don't know about you.
Right. Well, when you think of the time, like now everything's so streaming and we have so many different options on what we watch. But back at that time, there were like some satellites, but that was usually for people who were middle class to upper middle class and up. But you had broadcast television, and that came through an antenna, and not necessarily cable. So the fact that it was 12th and was able to reach people in that way, I think that says something about the show.
Well, and the other thing that's probably important to note too is that it's not as accurate as, say, like Netflix. Netflix metrics, though they don't share them, Netflix and their metrics are bang on. They're 100% because it's digitally recorded and it records everything that everyone watches and for how long they watch it. And when they turn it off, it records everything from everyone. So it's a far more accurate representation, whereas the Nielsen thing, it didn't represent certain people, and like it's not as accurate.
No, it's not. And I remember ages ago, and be prepared, because I'm sure that I will break up everything with stories, because that's who I am.
Go for it.
We were selected to be a Nielsen family. And so we had this paper that came to us and we had to fill it out. And then we had this box that came onto our TV, and it kind of measured everything that we watched. And it only picked a number of households that recorded this. So it absolutely wasn't accurate at all.
It's interesting to see, though, what the public response is and how that can change a show, particularly with the fact that this was on ABC. And as I said, we've discussed before Twin Peaks. That was also on ABC, and that got a lot of retooling. And like one of my favorite shows growing up was Alias, and that had a lot of retooling. They didn't want to do the long form storytelling. They were worried people weren't going to be able to catch up on it, so they tried to do a lot of like single episodes and stuff like that. And I was like, ABC, have you not figured it out after Dynasty and Twin Peaks? Like, people are okay with long form storytelling. So they seem to be notorious for the corporate meddling.
Yes.
And I'm fully making this up, but the reason why I feel like Dynasty was greenlit is because it was like, okay, this is going to be our Dallas.
Oh, definitely.
So it's, even though they were trying something different, and then obviously, they try something different, and then they're like, no, we're going to push this back. But clearly nothing's changed. And if anything, it's worse now that like they don't give shows a chance to breathe. And fortunately, Dynasty made the cut and they were able to make those changes. But now I think it's even worse that it's like, oh, if you don't get 70 bajillion views on the first night, then we're just going to scrap it. And it's like, you've got to give these shows time to find their footing. And I wonder how many great shows now are not given the chance to actually find their footing.
Well, and you have to take into account the impact that social media has on things too. Look at Making a Murderer on Netflix. Like, handful of people watched it, and then that was all anyone was talking about. Same with something like Tiger King. And, you look for those hashtags on the night that your show airs so that you have people to talk to about it. And networks, of course, pay attention to that.
We've been in a streaming age for so long that it's kind of hard to remember that, we didn't used to do that. Like, it'd be you would watch your show or you didn't watch it at all. Like, you watched it at this time, and that was it. For the young kids listening, that is how we used to live. Unless you had your VCR and you could record it.
Yeah, you had to learn
if you were
how to.
Fancy.
You're fancy to have a VCR. You're fancier if you could figure out how to record it.
All right. Well, then let's get into our specific notes on this episode. So you sort of touched on this before, but the theme music is the sort of classic, overly dramatic 80s music. So it's not even necessarily exclusive to soap operas, though they're pretty full on with it. Because it kind of reminded me of like a hybrid of Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine in its like 80s/90s TV theme. And I loved it.
Yeah. And it sets the tone, and you really know kind of what to expect, which I think is good, because when you have the first scene with him in that badass library, okay, so we're dealing with some fancy people.
We do open on that scene, but then we very quickly cut to Krystle's bridal shower. Now, Krystle, I've written here down in my notes, she's a combination of Camilla Parker Bowles and Margaret's Hot Lips Houlihan from MASH. That's kind of like, not even character-wise, but that's just what she looks like. And to be honest, if anything, Camilla Parker Bowles probably stole her look from Krystle.
Probably. Just like she stole Prince Charles from Diana. Oh, did I say that?
Whoop. Drama! They have this bridal shower, and it's one of the moments where I was just like, ugh, made me roll my eyes, but like in a way that I love. And that was the character of Doris. Like, just when they have that, and she's like, oh, you gave her this crappy little riding crop and everyone made fun of it. So then you get all pissy about that. And then, she carries on about the joy of sex. And it's like, it's like white, virgin white, like Bible-like version of the joy of sex. It's not raunchy at all. She's like, oh, I find a little raunchy myself. And I was like, oh, who invited you, Doris?
But, for that time, think of 1981, right? And think of how, like, that's before the 80s really happened and people really started to express themselves. And before you had like the really badass music from the 80s. Think of like the audience that's watching this, and for them to have and show the joy of sex on nighttime TV, where someone from middle America will see it, was actually a pretty big deal.
Well, yeah, it might be. But the thing is, they're having this great party, and she literally is just like, she's like that person on Twitter that just can't let you be happy, because she turns around and they're all talking about, oh, you're getting married and it's going to be great. And she's like, oh, but your ex-boyfriend. And it's like, who brings up someone's ex-boyfriend at a bridal shower?
Doris. That's who does it.
Doris does. Jesus, Doris. Read the room.
Doris was Karen before there was Karen.
Well, actually, interesting fact about Doris, because I looked her up to see if she appears again, because I'm like, I don't hate her, but I like to make fun of her. She does appear in one more episode, but I looked at the actress, and the actress is actually Jim's mum from American Pie. And so I was like, so she went on to be a prude later on, probably maybe more justifiably so.
Oh, wow.
And then we cut to her ex-boyfriend, Matthew, and this will be your field because they're in the Middle East, and I feel like you've got plenty to say about that.
So yeah, they are siphoning oil out of the Middle East, and they are getting kicked out. And I will just say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I remember, and perhaps you remember too, the oil and gasoline shortages of the late 70s and the oil drive in the early 80s, the breaking up of Iran and the Shah being kicked out, what that did for oil stores and who had access to them. And the fact that we are still trying to get that oil, and there's so much power in that area regarding this natural resource. I thought it was pretty interesting. I also thought that it was pretty interesting that those had to be the absolute whitest Middle Easterns that I've ever seen.
I thought the same thing, hashtag the Middle East so white. It it was particularly sort of like 80s television.
Oh, definitely. And the sign that says American dogs go home. Like I said, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And in my notes, I actually have the Middle East is pretty damn white.
Yeah, it is. And I guess the other thing is the locations too, because I'm sure it was filmed in the same location, is that it's funny how the Middle East kind of looks the same as Korea did in MASH.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
It's all just the desert in LA.
Right. One thing I want to touch base on going back to the bridal shower is that we really learned that Krystle is marrying into money and she's not from money. Her friends were so worried that she was going to change now because she's marrying Blake Carrington. And I wrote down famous last words. Krystle said, "I won't change. I swear it." And I'm looking forward to watching her like losing those like good, humble, middle class morals and to give them away for this life of access that she is about to live.
Yeah, losing that connection to her roots. Like,
yes.
And I mean, it's got to happen because it's got to be foreshadowed like that.
And it's something that really sets her apart from the Carringtons and who she's marrying into and how she's treated. And that is a big theme I found in these first the first 3 episodes of Dynasty.
Yeah. Well, then we move on to Blake Carrington again in his probably first real scene rather than just a let's go out and see Krystle scene. And he doesn't want Krystle's ex Matthew, and he's kind of being a bit of a dick about it. But I will say that every time I hear John Forsyth talk, I hear Charlie from Charlie's Angels. Like, not that I watched the original one. I believe he was in the original one, but the one with Drew Barrymore, that's what I hear. Like, good morning, angels. And now you'll probably hear that too.
He wasn't even the first Blake Carrington. There was another man that played him, and they actually reshot the pilot to have him as Blake.
Yeah, which is interesting because I think that's happened with a couple of the characters. We're then introduced to Stephen Carrington, who's a particularly kind of interesting character, particularly for the time.
When I first saw him on the plane,
which is the largest plane in the world.
the double-decker plane. I kind of rolled my eyes because I was like, not typical rich boy drinking and access and drugs and acting a fool like he's a frat boy everywhere he goes and subjecting everyone to it. And boy, I was wrong. But I think that it's great that they give you that first initial impression because it makes the impact of his character even stronger.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the other thing that's great about the writing in this that you don't get now is obviously there is more to his story, but they don't just throw it at you straight out the gate. Like, they make you work for it.
Yeah, I love that. I don't want to be told everything. I want to be taken on a ride. I want to be on this journey with these characters instead of having everything thrown at me up, at face value. That's why I appreciate how they introduced the idea that Krystle is not from money. And they did it in the form of her friends and her apartment. And then you see this with Steven. I think it's just a really great character development.
I think it is good. And I think that they've done a great job in the sense that, like, I don't think we find out what the actual story is until the very end of part 2, which is a pretty long time. Like, whereas now, particularly considering that it is quite a monumental thing, I think if this was done today, they would mention it like straight out the gate and it'd be a focal point. But it's like, it has more weight to it because you're sitting here thinking, okay, well, what's his problem? Like, why is he behaving in this way? Why does he have an issue with his father?
Yes, exactly. And, it made me think, does it have something to do with his mother? And just the interaction between Matthew and Steven. At first, he was so happy to see him, and then he lashed out at him, and he dropped a bomb about a wedding, but didn't say who it was. And he's a very complex man, Steven is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that you've referenced something good too, that like he didn't just say, oh, he's marrying Krystle, zoom in on the face and that weird like expression that they make in soap operas. It was left as a hanging thread to build on the tension that he still doesn't know who he's marrying.
Yes. Like, I think there's so many things just from a storytelling perspective that were done right in this pilot episode. I really, really enjoyed it.
Matthew just gut punches Steven and then he thanks him for it later. And I'm like, not sure I would have thanked him for it. But then again, I probably wouldn't have acted that way. So maybe we're just different people. And then there was a very interesting thing, which was, again, subtle might not even be the right word, but it was a sort of subtle nod to something else not being right without actually telling us. And that was when he leaves the airport, but his father hasn't sent a car for him. He says, go and get a taxi.
He sent the car for Matthew, though.
Yes.
And Michael, the chauffeur, is actually played Roman Brady in Days of Our Lives.
It's interesting how different people will jump from different soap operas.
Right. Well, he played Roman for a span of time, and then another actor took over, and then he played him again. And then he returned to Days of Our Lives as someone completely different for a couple episodes.
See, I love that they do that. I love that they just don't care.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll see that in Dynasty too, from what I understand. But I remember Days of Our Lives is a daytime soap opera that we watched when I was little. And so when I saw him, I'm like, hey, it's Roman.
Well, and I have some thoughts on Michael, but that's for later on in the discussion. So Matthew and Krystle have a brief run-in. This is the one in the office, and it's not particularly exciting as a conversation, I didn't feel, but I was more excited to see the giant puffy coat because, like, I was looking forward to it being like a really like excessive 80s style show in that regard as well. And I know it becomes that, but it's fairly restrained in the beginning. So it was nice to see the big fluffy coats and all the excess.
I have written down that feathered hair and fur coat of Krystle's. Damn.
That just sums it up, doesn't it? That sums up everything. Damn. They kind of, as I said, I wasn't really particularly caring about that particular interaction in that scene. But then Matthew's wife is away, which is another thing that I think they handled really well, that it wasn't like, oh, by the way, here's the exposition about my wife. It's, we don't know what's happening with his wife.
Right. Right. And so we've been set up that there's something between Krystle and Matthew. And then Krystle and Matthew see each other, and there's a little bit of tension there. And Krystle gets angry and stomps off and speeds off. And then we see him holding the photograph with his wife and daughter in it. And I was like, but wait a minute, like he was with Krystle and he's got what am I missing? So there's a moment of confusion there. And then it dawned on me, I'm watching a primetime soap opera. So of course there's going to be adultery there.
I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it?
Yeah. But just by showing the photograph, I think was a really great way to introduce that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And then we move on to Krystle being spoken to like crap from the butler, who I originally thought was a gay wedding coordinator. I don't know if I'm the only one that thought that.
When I saw this scene, I wrote down, do people still build houses with ballrooms in them? And then when Stephen saw how she was being treated and spoke up for her, I was like, I don't trust his motives. Why is he being nice to her and being the way he is with the wedding planner? And then I was wrong. He just was being a stand-up guy and wasn't going to put up with how she was being treated. And that is another layer of Stephen's character.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, that it keeps you guessing. It's not like, okay, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, done.
No, it is a television show that you need to pay attention to. You can't just zone out because there's so many subtle and beautiful ways that the story is unfolding. You know, like an example, that photo and him looking at that photo and him having this house where he's removing the dust covers from. Like, that is a beautiful moment of storytelling. Yeah.
And like, this isn't like The Bold and the Beautiful, which I have to admit I've seen a little bit of, but it's not anything I've watched. But I've seen it when it's on at 4:30 in the afternoon, and yeah, it's like that. You could watch it one day and then 6 months later watch it, and like the same thing is still happening. Like, whereas this is telling a complete narrative over the course of that like 49 minutes or 47 minutes.
Right. I agree. I definitely agree with that.
So then we're introduced to Fallon, who has a bit of a problem with Krystle.
Oh, Fallon.
I have a complicated relationship with Fallon. Fallon.
As someone who is a mother, I have a very, very complicated relationship with Fallon.
Because I guess at this point, I probably was thinking sort of what you were thinking about, Stephen, where you're like, ugh, gee, what an entitled, spoiled little brat.
Right.
But obviously it changes as the story goes on. But one thing I did put down in my notes is that I think from a writer perspective, they've done really well with the two siblings, because Stephen is so supportive of his father, but he's actually not afforded that same, I don't know, privilege, for want of a better word. Whereas Fallon is the golden child and she's a complete bitch to Krystle.
Yes. Yeah. And what was interesting to me with Fallon is the way she interacted with her father. And how, I don't want to say she's manipulative, but maybe she's a little manipulative.
I think she might be
in her relationship with him.
But that's that's obviously sort of coming back to, the idea that she gets developed later on, and there's a lot more to her than we get in this initial scene.
One of the things that I really appreciated about the show, and especially for at the time when in the United States anyway, like family was a mother and a father, and you were together forever and you didn't divorce. And if you did divorce, then you stayed single. And I really appreciate that this show is showing two previously married middle-aged people, a man and a woman, getting remarried. And for that time, that was pretty bold too.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, it's very easy to forget that, things that are happening with Stephen or things that are happening with Matthew and all these sorts of things. We're very quick to forget that they are kind of a big, like, they're not a big deal now, but they were a big deal back then.
Oh, definitely.
So I've written down here, and it just is worth mentioning that the Fallon love scene in the garage felt like a 70s porno. I don't know if it was the music.
All he needed was a mustache.
Yeah. I don't know if it was the music maybe, but it felt like it was the ramping up to being a 70s porno. And I'm like, look, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Because obviously, like with shows like that, it's, about the cheese to some degree as well.
Right.
But it was just worth noting.
In my notes, I wrote, Daddy's going to be so mad.
Yeah.
Because previous to that, they were talking about marriage and her marrying a Colby to make a basically business merger through marriage.
Yeah, that's right. And you're not going to be able to get any kind of money out of marrying your chauffeur.
No, but I think it does give us a really good insight to Blake too. Blake is ruthless and he's greedy and he's selfish and he wants what he wants and he doesn't care who else has to have sacrifices to get what he wants. At least that's the impression I'm getting right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's where I think he's quite a unlikable character for the most part. But ironically, the thing that humanizes him is not what you would expect, but we'll save that for part 2,
right?
Which I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
So Blake and Krystle have a fight just because that's what you do when you're about to get married. And then we have the scene where Blake doesn't want to see his son because he's kind of a dick. But I thought that scene had a great line, which was something like, "I'll bring this family back together." And he's like, "So I shall get you a whiskey, sir," or something like that. And I was like, yeah, that sounds about right.
I mean, I want someone to bring me whiskey.
Oh, that's what I've got it here. "I'm going to get this family in shape." And the butler replies, or Joseph, the butler replies, "Irish whiskey then." And I'm like, yeah, okay. That sounds like a good plan. We finally get to the last scene in this episode, which is Krystle and Matthew having a heart-to-heart. And he says that he doesn't have feelings for her. And I'm calling BS on that.
Oh, I'm definitely calling BS on
I'm
that.
pretty smart for thinking that, aren't I? Yeah, it's not like blatantly obvious.
I wrote down my favorite line of the show was actually in this interaction between Krystle and Matthew. And he says, "The truth isn't hard to say. Just spit it out and kick sand over it." I thought that was a brilliant line. I loved it.
Nice. Well, that pairs nicely with my Irish whiskey one. It's like two ends of the spectrum. So there you go. That's it. That's the episode. So now I guess we're going to go to Amy Presents The More You Know.
Well, for this, I'm going to take one little thing from an episode and I'm going to look into it and I'm going to share because I like to do that. I go down rabbit holes. So for this one, it's just oil because I have to say that I was pretty ignorant about the role that oil plays in Colorado. And I think that is probably because I watched Dallas and to me, Texas and oil is synonymous. But crude oil is produced in 32 states in the US and in US coastal waters. And in 2020, 71% of all crude oil production came from 5 states. And it was Texas, who is the largest domestic producer, North Dakota, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Alaska. The funny thing about Colorado being on this list, though, is that I found this article from the Colorado Sun from this year, from August 22nd, 2021. And it states that in 2020, there were 17,196 inactive wells in Colorado producing less than 1 barrel of oil a day. 9,585 of those produced none at all. There was another 8,538 wells producing low output, which was 1 to 5 barrels a day. So between the 17,196 inactive wells and the 8,538 low producing wells, those take up nearly half of the wells in Colorado. And people are wanting the state to deal with these wells and these abandoned, orphaned properties. And so right now, they're trying to pass legislation to do that. And in Colorado, they're plugging up more wells now than what they're drilling there. So that's what you need to learn today on The More You Know. You get to learn about oil. I
was obviously worse than you. That like when I think oil, I do think Texas, but it's probably from like, you know, what I've heard of, like, because I've never seen it, Dallas and like the Beverly Hillbillies and stuff like that. It's probably all come from American TV. So I've been pretty ignorant about that too. So it's really interesting to hear, because I thought when I heard it was in Colorado that it was just one of those things where they make stuff up on soap operas that don't even make sense.
Right.
So I just assumed that it was that. But there you go. It wasn't. So now we're going to move on to our games section, fun and games. And I've got a game for you today.
Okay.
To finish off, called Two Truths and a Lie Dynasty Edition. People can play along. We are going to go through 3 different rounds. And in each round, I'm going to give you a few different options of soap opera storylines. And you have to pick the one that doesn't appear in Dynasty. Now, these are all legitimate soap opera storylines. You just have to pick the one that's not happening in Dynasty. I was going to say the least crazy, but sometimes that's not true. It's not the least crazy. Okay, so round 1, we have after a brain surgery, a character is programmed to kill her husband. An alien visits in search of a crystal. A character must fight herself. Which one doesn't happen on Dynasty?
And the alien one.
An alien visits in search of a crystal.
Yes.
That is correct. So
yay!
That is actually a plot line from General Hospital, but an alien visited a little girl because he was in search of a crystal. It just makes me laugh. But you would think, oh, okay, well, Dynasty is never going to resort to aliens. However, the spin-off, The Colbys, actually had an alien abduction plot.
Oh my God.
So don't rule anything out. Nothing's off the table. Round 2, a royal wedding is interrupted by a terrorist attack. There is an intense argument over champagne and caviar, and a character gives birth to her rival's baby.
A character gives birth to her rival's baby.
Got it again. It's
yay!
That was a plotline from The Bold and the Beautiful.
Oh gosh. I feel like I need to watch all of these things now because I've never seen any of them.
Well, I like I said, I had seen an episode of The Bold and the Beautiful when it was just on late afternoon TV. Was not great. There was a man falling in love with a mannequin, and it was particularly bad. But
that sounds like a Doctor Who episode.
No, because it was a mannequin of his it was a mannequin of his stepsister.
If you say sister, I'm leaving right now.
No, stepsister, and it's a lot. I mean, thankfully, that's not what we're watching now. I don't think I'd make it very far. Okay, so round 3. A character is killed by falling into a volcano. They are visited by a US president, and they discover buried Nazi treasure.
Oh, man. Well, see, the president thing, because we know that Mr. Carrington uses his business connections with politicians by the conversation they had about the Middle East oil. So that, I think, is a possibility. The volcano one, that rings a bell to something, but I don't know what it does. And so what was the third one?
They discover buried Nazi treasure.
They discover buried Nazi treasure.
That's your answer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think that's unfortunately the one that you've got wrong. It is a character is killed by falling into a volcano was from The Young and the Restless.
Yes, Young and the Restless. My mom watched Young and the Restless and then Days of Our Lives after it. And so I knew something familiar was with that.
Yeah.
But oh man.
But then when you say they discover Nazi treasure, you kind of weren't expecting that one.
No, I wasn't expecting that at all.
Apparently that happens very late in the show. I don't know exactly when, but apparently it happens very late in the show when obviously the show starts to go off the rails, which I am all for. I am all for it going off the rails because
I can't wait.
I'm all for the soapy cheesiness of it all. And that's it for our episode 1. Tune back in for the next episode where we'll break down Oil Part 2 and we'll discuss more about the messed up Carringtons and their deep, dark secrets that will slowly get revealed. So I'm AG.
And I'm Amy.
And we look forward to seeing you next time. What are your thoughts on the series so far? Let us know by leaving us an audio message at anchor.fm/ragstobitches. You can also reach out to us on our social media with all the links below. We can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, keep it classy and keep the party going.